Okay, I guess we'll get started this morning. Thank you all so much for coming on the last day at 8 a.m. I think everyone sitting here is the most hardcore people at OHBM because you're still here at 8 a.m. on the last day after having lots of fun with your colleagues, probably until the wee hours last night. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome to the Good Noise and Neural Computation workshop. I'm going to give you a nice overview of the importance of noise. Hopefully I will convey that in a nice way, and then the following lectures will be subsequently more detailed about the different points that I bring up about the importance of noise. So let's get started. So in functional neuroimaging analysis, we typically define noise as variability that results from unpredictable or random disturbances. And noise is typically considered to be a nuisance in most of our data. That pesky noise that just keeps popping up. As someone who's done a lot of EEG fMRI data collection, I can tell you that noise is a very serious problem, and I should probably host a support group for all people who do simultaneous EEG fMRI data collection. It's an extremely frustrating process. But essentially, most of the time, it's our goal to try and remove noise as much as possible from both EEG as well as from fMRI data. And most of the time, this is an extremely important pre-processing step, and I think it's absolutely necessary in most types of analyses. For example, running a first-order high-pass filter is very common with EEG because it helps us detrend the EEG data, and removing fluctuations from the bold data that are unlikely to reflect changes in the HRF, for example, low-pass filters, can help us reveal more information in the bold data. However, sometimes, every once in a while, when we do these types of filtering and we try really hard to remove the noise, we are also removing signal. So one thing that I found interesting when I learned about the bright shaft potential is that there's these low frequency changes in the EEG that reflect the readiness potential. And most recently here at OHBM, there's some nice work by Amelie Haug and colleagues showing that when they actually removed high frequency oscillations in the bold signal, they were no longer able to detect differences in naturalistic viewing over connectivities. So in electrical engineering analysis, there's this old adage that says, noise never helps. But that's mostly for linear systems, because most of the time, engineers love to assume an LTI system, a linear time invariant system. And certainly in those types of systems, noise is definitely detrimental to communication and over channels. But many aspects of neural computation are both noisy and nonlinear. Starting from ion channels, ion channel gating is highly stochastic and random. Dendritic computation and graded potentials are very noisy. The generation of action potentials is also quite stochastic. And overall, this eventually leads to a high trial-to-trial variability in neuronal signaling. So this leads to this really interesting aspect of neural signaling that I like to think about, which is that perhaps the information about sensory and motor variables is represented in the firing rates as opposed to the spikes themselves. And Ma and colleagues have pointed out that this aspect of neural computation helps neurons actually compute probabilities quite effectively. This is known as the Poisson rate coding hypothesis. It turns out that neural sampling and signal transduction is also quite noisy, and you're going to hear about this more during Andrew Doyle's lecture on the colors of noise. So the transducers, for example, photoreceptors, that transduction process is quite noisy, and correlated noise in the nonlinear neural networks are also very important in direction selective neurons. So one reason that noise might be helpful is that noise in the brain seems to follow this 1/f frequency, and that 1/f background of noise may provide a frequency landscape for low amplitude signals to resonate with. And this is known as stochastic facilitation because in certain nonlinear dynamical systems, the presence of a weak or periodic input cannot be inferred from the response of the system in the absence of noise. So in many fields, this is referred to as stochastic resonance, but McDonald and Ward and colleagues have suggested a shift towards calling this stochastic facilitation. And I find this to be quite fascinating in terms of one of the aspects of how noise can be quite beneficial. And Biswa Singh Gupta, who unfortunately could not be here, but he's a member of the Phil and he was planning to speak next after me, has done some amazing work with Carl Friston and Martin Stemler and colleagues, showing that there's a really interesting interplay between energy efficiency, information rate, sparse coding, and noise in both digital and analog signaling. So in this case, noise can actually be quite helpful in terms of energy efficiency if the noise is at a low amplitude. He says less than 40 decibels. I'm not sure how that works out, but he's done some beautiful calculations to show this. It turns out that, interestingly, noise is actually also quite helpful in training artificial neural networks. So dropout, for example, is one technique where a specific neuron in the network is dropped out along with its connections. You're going to hear a lot more about dropout in the next lecture from Dan Moyer, so I won't elaborate too much on this, but it turns out that dropout can be quite helpful. Stochastic gradient descent is another example of how noise can be useful in training neural networks. So SGD randomly selects a data point for gradient descent, and this is also extremely helpful. It turns out that when you use stochastic gradient descent, you end up with loss functions that have a minimum which is wider, and this leads to better generalizations typically. Another thing which is interesting is occasionally adding noise to our labels. Label noise or teacher noise is actually also helpful, which I found completely fascinating. So at the deep learning educational course earlier in the workshop, I talked about one of my favorite classification problems, which is, can we classify the difference between blueberry muffins and chihuahuas? So you might be too tired, so it all looks like blueberry muffins because you're hungry and you want breakfast. But if this was the classification problem, then perhaps occasionally telling your artificial neural network that it's a muffin when in fact it's a chihuahua would actually help in the overall accuracy in the end. It's thought that this can help avoid catastrophic inference, for example, and help move, during training, move the function out of local minima and into better global minima, for example. There's also this thing known as stochastic rounding, which is nice because stochastic rounding also has this tendency to improve classification accuracies in deep learning neural networks. So this is just as you might expect, we get a tiny bit of round-off error just due to precision and numerics. And so making that rounding process stochastic actually is quite helpful. So this helped me personally answer a question which had been bothering me for years, which is that I typically have used independent components as features in decoding analyses. And I was always very curious why certain independent components that very clearly had spatial overlap with, say, the cerebrospinal fluid areas and the ventricles seemed to boost classification accuracy. You might expect noise to help boost the accuracy if it co-varies with your features, but when they're independent, it actually still helps, which is kind of amazing. So I think overall, one of the challenges is how do we bring together these fields of computational neuroscience, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence? So Nico Kriegeskorte and I have written an extremely long review paper with tons of references talking about all of the different ways that we can bring these fields together with the goal of creating task-performing computational models that mimic brain information processing using biologically plausible dynamic components. So one avenue towards reaching this might be to start with biologically plausible dynamic systems models. So the population density models shown here are typically used as measurement models to subtend, for example, dynamic causal modeling techniques. But moving forward, one might start to use these models for classification purposes. So if you start to connect, for example, a series of canonical microcircuit models, then you might end up with something very similar to a deep learning neural network, and that network might be able to accomplish certain cognitive tasks. On the flip side of things, we might start to use existing artificial neural network architectures and try and make them even more biologically plausible. So to some extent, artificial neural networks have always been inspired by neuroscience, but they haven't been explicitly used to create biologically plausible models or to try and recapitulate the dynamics we might observe in EEG or fMRI data. So I've shown some historic artificial network models here. So starting with the perceptron, people then moved towards adding different hidden layers, recurrent and convolutional neural networks. I show the winner take all here just because even though this is a really, really old model, it's nice because it shows lateral inhibition, which is, of course, biologically plausible. People have now moved towards neural networks that include probabilistic refractory periods. And I think autoencoders are also a great model of possibly what's happening in the brain. And there's also denoising, sparse, and variational autoencoders. So there's a whole variety of autoencoders that I think are quite important. So I think recently it's fair to say that artificial neural networks have become a valuable tool for modeling cognitive and sensorial processes that take place in the human brain. And convolutional neural networks, I think in particular, are attractive because they preserve input representations spatially. So you get something perhaps analogous to retinotopy or tonotopy. And here's just two examples, but there are so many at this point. Here's one about vision and object recognition from Nico Kriegeskorte. And these filters here represent, after the feed forward pass, you go backwards and you deconvolve the network after you've trained the weights. So these filters end up being the inverse transpose of the convolution matrix. So what you can see is that they do in some sense, represent features of what we might expect at different processing stages in the visual processing stream. There's also some interesting new work with grid cells and navigation by Bonino and colleagues, as well as possibly others prior to that group. So I do really like this idea of autoencoders, which you will hear about more in the coming lectures, mostly because of this idea of predictive coding, which suggests that the brain creates an internal model of the statistical regularities of the external world, which, for example, the ocean tides tend to follow a 1/f frequency power law, as well as EEG signals. So I think this is quite nice. Hopefully everyone after this meeting is going to take the weekend and go stare at a beach like this and refresh your attentional reserve by just staring at 1/f for some time. Bayesian models are also a very nice class of models that are quite useful, and I think on some level bridge both the computational neuroscience world as well as the artificial neural network world. Essentially, Bayesian models often do this process known as Bayesian belief updating, where you calculate your posterior, and that posterior becomes your prior in the next update. And there's this nice hierarchical message passing that takes place. And so if one ignores the likelihood, which likely reflects the background noise happening in the brain, then the cost function just becomes this KL divergence between the posterior and the prior. But what's kind of interesting about the KL divergence, which has been pointed out by Ian Goodfellow in a number of his papers on generative adversarial networks, is that the KL divergence is actually asymmetric. And so if you use this process through updating, you're going to get quite different results depending on whether the processing is top down or bottom up. So one avenue that I think is actually relatively unexplored is to use aspects of human brain development or ontogeny for developing the architectures of artificial neural nets. So it's known in artificial neural networks that it's better to start with a dense network and then move to a thinner neural network through something, for example, known as weight pruning or weight decay. But in the human brain, we're born with probably roughly twice as many neurons that we have after just a few years of life. And apoptosis is actually a very stochastic process in the human brain as well. So bringing in stochasticity into this weight pruning and making it more biologically plausible is something that has been an active area of research in my own work. And I think that there's much, much further to go in this sense, because the cell death, the programmed cell death that occurs over development is actually not just, it's not ubiquitous across the brain. So there are certain areas of the brain where this programmed cell death is much more likely to occur. Another thing that I think is fascinating is the extent to which we have skip connections in the brain. So there's considerable evidence to show that the long-range connections become much more robust and have increased connectivity over development. But what's fascinating is when you add skip connections to artificial neural networks, you also end up with loss functions that are a lot more smooth. And this, again, will lead to, at least in theory, much better generalizations. So this slide is inspired by a talk from Jan LeCun at IPAM earlier this year. He most certainly agrees that neuroscience will probably inspire some of the best algorithms moving forward, but he thinks that the best algorithms to help us derive the optimal artificial neural net architectures will be unsupervised. And I think this is also fascinating because, at least in the human brain, right after birth, there's very little opportunity for a teaching signal per se. So just to conclude, of course, filtering out noise is still vital to almost every neuroimaging analysis. However, examining noise may also reveal otherwise hidden aspects of important features in our data. Modeling the noise may also help explain some of the non-stationary aspects of brain processing. So I think likelihood, for example, could be quite tightly related to this. Deep learning techniques, of course, may be a very useful model of certain aspects of cognition, and stochastic aspects of development and brain computation may inspire improved or more biologically plausible deep learning architectures. But of course, there's no free lunch, so I think it's unlikely that one model will universally work best across all different systems in the brain. It's possible that, for example, the free energy might be a universal cost function, but we would certainly need more bespoke models for different parts of the brain, like the hippocampus, for example, and also the cerebellum, which is made up almost entirely of feed-forward connections. So I'll just end on this quote, which I think is quite fun, from Alan Turing's imitation game paper from, I think, right around 1950. If machines are meant to be infallible, they will never be intelligent. So thank you all so much. A number of the papers here are almost in press, and they will be posted shortly on arXiv. And so if you follow me on Twitter, you don't have to. You can just check my Twitter account, and I'll post all of that information there. So thank you so much.